I'm here today is to personally thank you and every service member throughout this region for the near elimination of the ISIS territorial caliphate in Iraq and in Syria. 2 years ago, when I became president, they were a very dominant group. They were very dominant. Today, they're not so dominant anymore.
And so, James, did it sound like there that he got much support from the troops on this strategy of actually withdrawing US soldiers from Syria and Afghanistan? Because there's been a fair bit of blowback on that as well as support.
Well, a fair bit of blowback, and indeed what we just heard the President say there, that effectively it's mission complete or almost mission complete, is something that not only some members of his own Republican Party vehemently disagree with, in fact some leading members of that party disagree with him. It's also fair to say that we're getting some pretty strong signs that members of the Army, senior members of the Pentagon and his own advisors actually don't really agree with that as well. Nevertheless, this has been one of Donald Trump's kind of main promises. Yep. He is going to scale down troop deployments where Americans are overseas. Particularly, it has to be said, Syria, which is where the troops are coming out of, and also Afghanistan. Where he went in Iraq, he's in an area that used to be controlled, or at least to be heavily influenced by the Islamic State terrorist group, is probably the only main theatre where American troops are still serving, where he hasn't kind of made holes, so he hasn't put a timeline on a rapid withdrawal of troops. So I think strategically that was probably one of the safer places for him to go and make this kind of announcement. It's also got to be said that Donald Trump obviously is not a particularly conventional president in many ways, but this is a very, very deeply conventional thing to do. A lot of recent presidents have made a real thing of visiting serving troops, not necessarily always overseas, but serving troops around the festive season. And so this is the time to do this kind of trip.
Yeah. And James, so the breadth of opposition to that decision to withdraw troops from Syria and Afghanistan has been significant there in the US. Is there any indication that the president is likely to rethink that at all or not?
Well, it's going to be really interesting to see, and I guess my initial instinct would be no, because obviously he made this decision and then he lost his fairly well respected by Trump administration standards Defence Secretary Jim Mattis, who's not universally loved. We shouldn't make out that he is bigger than he is, but within the Trump administration he was someone that Western allies in particular really respected. They thought he was someone who really put a lot of value on America's alliances around the world. They thought he was someone who was happy for America to implement what's known as the rules-based order, effectively the rules that countries kind of work with each other under, and he was seen as a big proponent of that. And whereas on the other hand, Donald Trump's kind of seen as someone who may have a more transactional worldview. He wants to make sure if America's securing allies that America's getting something out of it, either through trade or at least not getting what he says is ripped off. So we've heard a lot of that kind of rhetoric, and I think what we're going to see is Donald Trump perhaps pick someone more in that mould, more that may get along with him. But of course, that really is speculation, because we are still waiting to see who is going to replace Mr. Mattis in the long run. We've only heard an acting Defence Secretary announcement, and indeed Mr. Mattis's departure just a couple of days ago was brought forward by a few months. So the timing of this visit is quite significant, because I think the withdrawal, the removal of Mr. Mattis, or the departure of Mr. Mattis from defence, had not only really shaken up some of America's traditional allies and some members of Congress, but also reports in American media outlets at least suggested that some senior commanders and some members of the military were quite concerned about it as well. And perhaps this visit, Donald Trump's been criticised for some time for not visiting the troops. Perhaps this visit was a way of the White House showing that Donald Trump really does care as much about the serving men and women as he always has said that he has done as well. And it's also worth noting, Joe, that while Donald Trump was there on the ground, he was also asked about the domestic political issue, which has been really infuriating here in Washington. That is the partial government shutdown. And he said that he's happy to keep the government shut down for as long as it takes to get his border wall with Mexico, which of course he's demanding some $7 billion extra dollars to get to build.
OK, we'll leave there. James Glenday reporting from Washington. And Wall Street has rebounded dramatically from its worst